The dust of the high plains bit at Alara's chapped lips, tasting of despair and the dry, unforgiving earth. Above her, the sun beat down with a relentless fury, mirroring the heat that simmered in her chest. A potent cocktail of shame and a primal, searing will to survive. She stood on a makeshift platform in the heart of what barely qualified as a town square, a crude stage cobbled together from rough-hewn planks. Around her, 3 other women, their faces etched with a similar grim resignation, formed a silent tableau. All were, as the auctioneer had crudely bellowed moments ago, of childbearing age and sturdy constitution. It was a sale of flesh, of futures, of the last tattered remnants of dignity in a world that had stripped them bare. Alara clutched the worn calico of her dress, her knuckles white. Her husband, Thomas, taken by the fever months ago, had left her with a ruined farm and nothing but debts. The children, bless their souls, had gone first, spared this degradation. Now, here she was, her only commodity her body, her only hope a buyer who might offer a future less cruel than starvation or worse. The crowd before them was a blur of rough faces, some openly leering, others merely curious, detached. Men who saw not women, but hands for labor, wombs for heirs, and bodies for use. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her, but she swallowed it down, fixing her gaze on a distant, shimmering horizon that promised only more heat haze. A hush fell as the auctioneer, a corpulent man named Jedediah, wiped sweat from his brow with a greasy rag. Next up, ladies and gentlemen, we have Alara Vance, widowed, 26 years of age, strong and healthy, capable hands for any task, domestic or otherwise. What am I bid for a good, honest woman looking for a new start? His voice was a rasping invasion, tearing through the fragile veil of her composure. She could feel the stares, feel their assessment, feel the weight of her desperation laid bare for all to see. A few low whistles, a snicker. Her eyes flickered across the faces, searching for something, anything, beyond the casual cruelty. Then, her gaze snagged on a man standing apart from the main throng, leaning against the weathered facade of the general store. He was tall, his frame lean and hard-muscled beneath a duster coat thick with dust. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she caught the glint of eyes that seemed to hold the vast, unyielding emptiness of the plains themselves. Silas. She knew him by reputation, a rancher from the high country, remote and solitary, known for his grim silence and an almost unnatural capability with horses. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he kept to himself. There was no lechery in his posture, no eager assessment. Just a quiet, unnerving stillness. The bidding began, a cacophony of shouts and countershouts that quickly escalated. $50, someone bellowed. 75, another. Each number was a hammer blow against her already fractured spirit. She heard the crude jokes, the references to prime stock. A man with a thick neck and a florid face, Caleb Thorne, was particularly aggressive, his bids rising sharply, his eyes fixed on Alara with an unpleasant possessiveness that made her skin crawl. He was known for his ruthlessness, his ill temper. A cold dread seeped into her bones. She would rather face the wolves than share a roof with a man like him. Just as Caleb roared 150, a voice, low and resonant, cut through the din. 200. It was Silas. Every head turned. The crowd murmured, surprised. Silas never bought into town gossip, never participated in such spectacles. His face remained unreadable beneath the hat's shadow, his gaze not on Alara, but on Jedediah, unwavering. Caleb Thorne scowled, but after a moment's hesitation, shook his head, his face a mask of thwarted greed. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Going once, going twice. Sold, to Silas Vance, for $200. Jedediah's gavel cracked, a sound that echoed like a final judgment in the sudden silence. Alara felt a strange, dizzying mix of relief and utter terror. She was sold, not to the monstrous Caleb, but to a ghost of a man whose reputation was as stark and barren as the landscape he called home. The ride out of town was silent, save for the creak of the wagon and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Alara sat stiffly beside Silas, her hands clasped in her lap, watching the familiar, sun-baked landscape recede. Every mile put more distance between her and the humiliation of the auction, but also deeper into the unknown. Silas, perched on the driver's seat, seemed to exist in a world of his own, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He offered no explanations, no words of comfort, not even a glance in her direction. He had simply handed her a canteen of water, the first act of basic human consideration she'd received in days, and gestured for her to climb aboard. The ranch was not a homestead. It was a fortress against the wilderness, carved out of rock and stubborn earth. A low-slung, sturdy cabin of rough-hewn logs, a weathered barn, and a corrals full of horses, their coats glistening in the late afternoon sun. No fences marked a clear boundary. The land simply stretched, vast and untamed, in every direction. It was a place of stark beauty and brutal isolation. As they pulled up, a lean, grizzled old man with one eye missing emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a grease-stained cloth. He nodded at Silas, his gaze briefly flicking over Alara with an expression that held no judgment, only a tired understanding. "Silas," he rasped, "you're back, and you got company." Silas merely grunted in response, swinging himself down from the wagon. "Alara," he said, his voice deep, gravelly, and surprisingly soft. "This is Jed. He helps me with the horses. He'll show you to the cabin." He walked towards the barn without another word, leaving her standing in the vast emptiness, the sun setting behind him in a blaze of orange and purple. Jed, the one-eyed man, gestured towards the cabin with a gnarled hand. "Come on, miss. Ain't much, but it's shelter. Silas ain't one for talkin'." His voice was not unkind. Alara followed, her feet crunching on the dry earth. The cabin interior was spare, clean, and surprisingly ordered. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and a small cot in one corner. There was a faint smell of wood smoke and leather. This was to be her new life. Days bled into weeks, marked by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. Alara fell into a rhythm of work that was both punishing and strangely cathartic. She cleaned the cabin until it gleamed, cooked simple meals over the hearth, mended Silas's sparse clothing, and tended a small, struggling garden patch. Each task was performed with a meticulous dedication, a silent assertion of her worth beyond the auction block. Silas watched her. She knew, though his gaze was always fleeting, his presence often felt more than seen. He was a man of the land, moving with an economy of motion, his hands calloused from years of working with horses and wood. He spoke only when necessary, his words sparse, direct, stripped of any excess. "Water," he'd say, pointing to the empty bucket. "Fire, if the hearth needed tending." Never a command, more an observation. She began to understand his silences, to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the quiet intensity in his eyes. He wasn't cruel, nor was he kind in any conventional sense. He was simply present, a stoic, unmoving pillar in the vast, indifferent landscape. He left her undisturbed, respected her space, and provided for her basic needs without question. One evening, a sudden, fierce dust storm swept down from the mountains, lashing the cabin with grit and howling winds. Alara, huddled by the hearth, felt a wave of the familiar fear, but then she saw Silas, standing by the window, watching the storm's fury with an almost contemplative stillness. "It'll pass," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind, but the words were a quiet anchor. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear or desperation, a nascent sense of safety, hard-won and fragile, in the presence of this quiet, enigmatic man. He hadn't just bought her. He had given her a space to simply be, to begin the long, arduous process of reclaiming herself. As the weeks stretched into months, a quiet understanding began to bloom between them, unspoken but deeply felt. Alara's fear had long since faded, replaced by a cautious respect. She saw the lines of exhaustion etched around Silas's eyes, the way his shoulders sometimes slumped after a long day of breaking a wild Mustang or repairing a damaged fence. He was relentless in his work, driving himself with an almost grim determination. She, in turn, worked alongside him when she could, learning to mend tack, to tend the small herb garden that Jed cultivated, even to handle the calmer horses. She discovered a latent strength in her own hands, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Her internal monologue, once dominated by despair, now pondered the complexities of survival, the intricate dance of man against nature, and the curious solace found in shared hardship. One crisp autumn morning, a rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a plume of dust against the pale sky. Alara, hanging laundry near the cabin, paused, a knot forming in her stomach. It was Caleb Thorne, the man who had bid so aggressively for her at the auction. He rode with a swagger, a sneer already forming on his lips as he approached. Silas, alerted by Jed, emerged from the barn, his posture suddenly rigid, his hand resting casually near the pistol holstered at his hip. Well, Silas, Caleb drawled, dismounting with an exaggerated flourish. Heard you finally got yourself some company. And such fine company too. His eyes raked over Alara, a possessive glint in their depths. Funny, I recall bidding on this one myself. Should have known you'd snatch her up, you quiet wolf. Silas said nothing, his face a mask of stone. But the tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken challenge. I'm here for a different kind of business, though, Caleb continued, shifting his weight. Heard tell you've got some prime stock ready for sale, some of those Black Ridge Mustangs you've been breaking. I'm willing to offer a fair price. If you're reasonable. His gaze flicked from Silas to Alara, a clear implication hanging in the air. The price of the horses or something else. Alara felt her blood run cold, but an unfamiliar resolve hardened her spine. She wasn't chattel anymore. Not truly. Silas's voice, when it came, was low and steady, like rocks shifting under a river. My horses aren't for sale, Thorne. Not to you. Caleb's sneer deepened. Now, that ain't no way to do business, Silas. We both know you're always short on hands. A man needs help on a ranch this size. Unless you've found a new way to pay for it. His eyes again lingered on Alara, a crude leer twisting his features. Alara took a step forward, her chin lifting. I am not for sale, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice surprisingly clear, though a tremor ran through her. Caleb laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. Still got spirit, do you? A shame it'll be broken. You bought her, Silas, but she looks like she'd prefer to be chosen. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Alara, ignoring Silas completely. It was a deliberate provocation, a challenge to Silas's quiet authority, and a brutal reminder of Alara's past. Silas moved then, not quickly, but with a fluid, predatory grace. He stepped between Caleb and Alara, effectively blocking Caleb's view of her, his tall frame a shield. I said the horses aren't for sale, he repeated, his voice now colder than the mountain winds. And neither is anything or anyone on this ranch. Now leave. Caleb's hand went to the pistol at his own hip, his eyes narrowing to slits. You always were too proud for your own good, Silas. Some things are meant to be owned. A tense standoff. Alara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, but strangely, not with terror, but with a fierce, protective instinct for Silas, for the fragile sanctuary they had built. She realized then that this was not just about her or the ranch, but about a fundamental clash of values. Caleb Thorne's hand hovered over his pistol, his eyes locked on Silas, a venomous glint in their depths. You think you're so mighty, keeping a woman like her cooped up in this wasteland? He sneered, his gaze sweeping dismissively across the ranch. She's wasted on you, Silas. You're a lonely man, always have been. And she's just property, bought and paid for, same as any head of cattle. His words, meant to sting Silas, ignited a different kind of fire in Alara. For too long, she had felt like property, a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a man's world. Now, standing beside Silas, something within her solidified. She reached down, picked up a heavy, gnarled piece of firewood from the stack beside the cabin, and held it firmly, her knuckles white. Silas saw the movement, a subtle shift of his eyes, but his focus remained on Caleb. "Get out, Thorn," he warned, his voice a low growl that held the promise of imminent violence. Caleb, mistaking Silas's stillness for hesitation, started to draw his weapon. In that same instant, Jed, the one-eyed ranch hand, emerged silently from the barn, a shotgun held loosely in his good hand, its barrel glinting in the sun. He didn't speak, simply positioned himself, a grim sentinel. The odds had shifted. Caleb hesitated, his eyes darting between Silas's unyielding stance, Alara's defiant, wood-clutching figure, and Jed's shotgun. The sneer faltered. He was outnumbered and, more importantly, outmatched in resolve. This wasn't just a quiet rancher and a bought woman. It was a unit fiercely protective of its own. With a frustrated snarl, Caleb slowly withdrew his hand from his pistol. "This ain't over, Silas," he spat, his eyes lingering on Alara with a promise of future trouble. "You can't keep a leash on what's meant to run free." He remounted his horse, spurred it viciously, and rode away in a cloud of dust, leaving behind only the lingering stench of menace. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of the wind. Alara lowered the firewood, her hand trembling slightly. Silas turned, his gaze meeting hers. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a quiet understanding. He nodded once, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. It was not gratitude, but something deeper, recognition of her courage, of her place beside him. He then turned to Jed, a silent exchange passing between the two old men. Jed gave a curt nod and disappeared back into the barn. Silas walked towards Alara, slowly, deliberately. He reached out not to touch her, but to take the piece of firewood from her hand. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, unexpected contact that sent a jolt through her. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "You were ready," he said, his voice soft, a hint of something akin to admiration in its depths. Alara felt a blush creep up her neck, but it was not shame. It was a warmth that spread through her chest, solid and real. "I was," she whispered, her voice surprisingly strong. "I am." He turned and walked towards the cabin, leaving her standing there, the vast sky above, the rugged land around her. But this time the isolation didn't feel like a curse, felt like a foundation. Alara looked out at the rolling hills, at the distant, towering mountains that seemed to hold the sky in their embrace. This ranch, once a place of desperate refuge, had become something else entirely. It was home. She had come here broken, a commodity bought for safety. But in the stark, unyielding landscape, and in the quiet, stoic presence of Silas, she had found something far more precious than mere safety. She had found her own resilience, her own dignity, and an unexpected, profound connection. She was no longer just Alara Vance, the widowed woman sold at auction. She was a woman who had stood her ground, who had found strength in the face of despair, and who had discovered that belonging could blossom in the most unlikeliest of places. A partnership forged not in words, but in shared defiance and unspoken trust. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land. But for Alara, the darkness no longer held the terror of the unknown. It held the quiet promise of a future she would build, not endure.